One of the most common questions that I receive is how long can you store water? I've done several videos on the channel about water storage, various containers and preservation methods, and there's plenty of information on the internet about this subject. Now, most information you can find online doesn't really address this question specifically of an expiration date on water because there's too many variables. So the honest answer to this question is how long can you store water is it depends. As quickly as I can, let me explain how long you can safely store water. We're going to talk about the methods to ensure that you can safely store it for a long time. I think that's a real takeaway here. Let's start by defining what I would consider 3 ways that we can view water, which we're going to cover in this video. Now, for our discussion, let's categorize them as wild, stored, and treated. Wild water is anything in nature or falling from the sky. Stored water has often already been treated at a municipal site. Now, additional additives like chlorine or hydrogen peroxide are added to the container to prevent algae or microorganism growth. And then there's treated water, be it chemically treated again, filtered through a charcoal or sand filter or a ceramic filter, boiled or pasteurized, or even evaporated, distilled through a solar or boiling process. So, having formed a framework of how we can categorize water, let's get back to answering our main question about water's longevity. Water doesn't really have an expiration date. It's really easier to rephrase the question to explore why water goes bad and what you can do about it. Now, your stored water can go bad for 3 primary reasons. First is the growth of microorganisms that can render the water undrinkable or even toxic. So to prevent this, we can take several precautions when we store the water. One is to keep it in a sealed container, not exposed to direct sunlight or air. So let me give you an example that I've got here. This is a typical water storage container. I've got a lid that I can screw on to keep it airtight. It's fully opaque, in other words, you can't see through it. And it's free of harmful chemicals like BPAs, which we know can cause harm. Now, storing water long-term in a clear container, it gives microorganisms what they need. Microorganisms like bacteria, viruses, and mold, and photosynthetic organisms like algae, they typically need light and oxygen to proliferate. Now, keeping the water stored away from light and the exchange of air by keeping the lid sealed significantly reduces the water's susceptibility to these invaders. Many municipal water systems, they put plenty of chlorine and other substances in the water to kill these microorganisms. So when storing water, you might want to consider adding chlorine. And while I don't think it's entirely necessary because of the levels of chlorine already in some municipal water supplies, adding your own, it gets the water to a guaranteed level of safety. And if you know how much chlorine is in your water, you will also know if you need to add any more. Now, many water districts release an annual report and have this information on their website. You can typically look it up by your local municipality. So it doesn't hurt to add chlorine, though, as I said, it may be a bit overkill. Now, the recommended amount of chlorine to add to water for long-term storage is 8 drops of 6% sodium hypochlorite bleach per gallon of water. And the recommended amount of hydrogen peroxide to add to water for long-term storage is 8 drops of 3% hydrogen peroxide per gallon of water. Now, these chemicals at that level are enough to hold at bay microorganisms and algae, but they're not harmful for human consumption. Now, in the past, I recommended water preservatives on videos that I've done when I've talked about water storage, and you can buy these on Amazon or any other website, but they're nothing more than really overpriced bleach. So stick with the recommended amounts of chlorine or bleach instead if you're going to add preservatives or, these chemicals to your water to make sure that they preserve and that microorganisms, again, can be kept at bay. Now, plus, when you aerate the water before you use it by pouring it between containers after you take it out of the water storage container, you want to let it stand for about 30 minutes, and these chemicals will typically vent off. And the last time I filled up my water storage barrels in my garage, I didn't add any chlorine to them. I've stopped doing that here recently because there's really enough chlorine in the water that I get from my local municipality. I've done it in the past, and after opening them up 2 years later, where I didn't add any chemicals to them, and I've opened up my barrels in my garage, there wasn't any growth. I couldn't smell anything and I couldn't see anything. There was no growth inside. Now let's talk about the second reason that stored water can go bad. It's due to chemical contamination from using a container that previously stored non-water substances or from using a container made for storing non-drinking water. Have you ever reused a plastic bottle like an orange juice bottle and you really couldn't get that orange taste out of it? Try drinking water out of your favorite stainless steel coffee cup. It's probably going to have a hint of coffee flavor to it. And that's referred to as chemical leaching. Far worse and potentially with serious health consequences in the future would be reusing something like a laundry detergent container that may contain harmful phosphates. If you were to store water in something that's currently had something like a detergent and you were to later drink it, while the water may not kill you right away, doing so could have long-term health consequences, and it could seriously make you ill just minutes after consuming it. So, using any non-approved water storage container can result in harmful chemicals embedded in the plastic leaching into your water. So, to avoid this, you want to use a container labeled as food grade or specifically made for storing water. Now, additionally, I get asked this all the time. Should you buy a used water barrel or an IBC tote that you can find online, maybe on Craigslist, to store water or for your rain harvesting? The answer is no. You have no idea what was stored in it previously. And unless you really trust the source and you've been told exactly what was stored in it and it's not a chemical, then sure, maybe, but again, you better know the source very well because your life literally could depend upon it. Now, one additional note, ideally, you want to store the water in a temperature-stable location. If it's stored in a very hot area, it could accelerate bacterial growth. And having said that, I do store my water barrels in my garage where it can get pretty toasty in the summertime, and I have not had any issues up to this point. So, as you can see here, this is a typical water storage container that I have next to our vehicles. There's no water in it right now, but in case we have to leave, I fill these up, and I've got several filled up outside that are on standby. They're small, they're portable, they're opaque, they're food grade, and again, these can be sealed off. I did an entire video on these and other options a few years ago, which I'll recommend that you check out. That really goes into various water storage options on the market that I've used, and they're safe to use. All right, let's talk about the third reason water can go bad. It's from chemicals contaminating it from the surrounding area. And this isn't so much of an issue if your container to start with is approved for water storage and is airtight. Now, even a pinhole leak, though, could result in a bacteria like Legionella, pneumonia, aka Legionnaire's disease, or something far worse like animal feces, which could get into your stored water supply. So, while chemicals like benzene might spill into your wild water supply of a river or even trickle down into your aquifer and well water, it's not likely that it's going to get into your stored water supply unless it was part of the container that you stored it in to begin with. So even then, it likely won't be at levels high enough to kill you. And speaking of which, I did a whole dedicated video that goes into a lot of detail regarding cleaning out a 55-gallon drum in order to store it away. I think the video was specific about storing water in your garage and getting those 55-gallon drums cleaned up and prepped so that you could actually fill them up with water. And again, I'll refer to that in the description section below. And the principles that I lay out in that video, they apply to any size water storage container. So let's say that you've taken the proper storage methods of using an approved container, added chemicals for storage, some non-scented chlorine, and you've kept it airtight and out of the light, and it's free from any biological or chemical contamination. How long is it going to be good for drinking? Technically, if you're prepared to treat or filter the water once you remove it from the container, the answer is pretty much indefinitely. Typically, you're going to hear that water should be rotated out about every 6 months, but that's a practice and not a hard rule. While water that has been properly stored may still be safe to drink after 6 months or longer, rotating stored water every 6 months, it's really good practice to ensure that the water remains fresh and of good quality. But as I mentioned, I've opened my water barrels I store in the garage years after filling them up, and there's no growth and no smell. Sure, I could filter it just to be sure, and I've got plenty of water filter options. Or if I was really worried, I could boil it or add chemical treatments. But here's the one thing that you may note. After 6 months, your water may taste flat or have an aftertaste of plastic. And you can eliminate some of that by aerating it before you drink it by either stirring it or leaving it in open air or pouring it between containers. If you know that you're not going to rotate procedurally every 6 months or so, then you should have the means to treat your water for consumption when you do pull it out of a container. And again, I have multiple filter options. Something like a simple LifeStraw, a mini cellular water filter, homemade charcoal filtration system, Brita or Berkey filtering systems, boiling the water. These approaches can make it drinkable just as it would be if you were to pull that water out of the wild. Now, there's also other options like additional chemical treatments or UV light treatment. These can be applied to stored water that appears questionable, but these approaches may be overkill. But again, there's nothing wrong with being overkill if you're not certain, I'll put it that way. You could even pump it out of your container through a filter. There's options on the market for that. And at the far extreme, you could always solar distill your stored water before drinking. I imagine, though, that most people want to simply pump out the water out of their storage and just drink it. And for the safest, cleanest, and best tasting drinking water, plan to at least filter and aerate the water that you're going to drink before, or rather after you pull it out of storage. So, does water go bad? Technically, no. But it can become contaminated if not properly stored, and I think we covered how to ensure that it does not. My encouragement is to have a plan to store water in an approved food-grade water container. The safest plastic containers to hold water are polyethylene-based plastics, or plastics with number 1, number 2, and number 4. This one on the bottom has number 2, HDPE, written right here on the bottom. And on their website, they state that it's food grade. Again, if you look at the bottom of different water containers, storage containers, if you go to the store, you're going to see those indicators and they'll tell you whether it's food grade. And again, this one has HDPE. So all food grade plastics are made of high density polyethylene, but be careful because something is made out of HDPE, number 2, might not necessarily be food grade. You always want to check the manufacturer's website to ensure that they state that it is food grade. The recommendation is to store at least a 3-week supply for every person and animal in your household. That amount will get you through most disasters, most regional disasters. But the general rule of thumb, and this is being very conservative, is 1 gallon of water per person per day that you store away. So if you want 3 weeks for one person, that would be 21 gallons. But again, that's on the low end. You probably are going to want way more as you'll probably use way more. But that's just a bare minimum. So ideally, you can store more, but again, that's a starting point. You want to follow good practices to treat the water going into the container itself, and making sure that the water is cleaned properly in advance. You want to ensure the container is not transparent and is stored airtight in a relatively temperature-stable environment. You want to keep the temperature free from wild fluctuations, and you want to plan to filter and aerate your water when you remove it from the container. And I've got a whole video dedicated to options for filtering and treating your water to make it safe, which I'll link to below. And if you can do all these things, you can confidently drink stored water several years out after you put it away. So if you can get into a 6-month or annual rotation of your water and you check it when you rotate it every 6 months, it gives you a few different advantages. First, you're going to know if your storage technique is working. If you open the container and the water is tinged, it's discolored, or it tastes or smells kind of odd or strong, or you smell chemicals or anything earthy, you might have a problem with your storage method. You don't want to find that out after a disaster. Now, secondly, rotating your water keeps your mind focused on your supply and water as a resource. And by rotating, you better understand what you should be doing on the front end, fluctuations of quantity needed, and what you might need when you extract it for consumption after a disaster. There are a lot of benefits to getting into a rotation practice, which is why I still recommend it. Now, admittedly, I don't personally rotate sometimes as I should or as often as I should, and some people never do. But I store it properly, and I've got multiple methods to make sure that it's suitable for drinking should it have any issues when I open it up. And in the past, I have rotated my barrels and other things, and I've opened them and they've been fine. So that's honestly why I haven't really rotated in a while, because I've gone through the techniques and I've never had any issues. But I have multiple methods that should I open them up and they have problems, I can deal with them. So if you don't rotate your water and there is some issue that comes up that you're not aware of, it may not kill you, but it could make you very ill. So you want to, again, just test it, especially if you're starting out. I would encourage you at the beginning, if this is just the beginning, when you're starting your water storage approach and you get 6 months into it, just check to make sure that there's no issues. Again, I'll link to our playlist on water so you can better understand your full range of options when it comes to water storage, treatment, quantity needed, and more. So I hope this video answered your questions about how long you can store water. I know it's a question that comes up all the time, and I decided to just do a dedicated video on this. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to post it below. And as always, stay safe out there.